dweller of the dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. More tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten are climbing out of the tombs. Check out our links below for more information. Subscribe, comment, like, donate, or I'll send the devil of Black Bayou to rip your head off, as we did the like button. Send us ghoulish delights for the Skull and Bones collection. Your pound of writer's flesh will feed our ghouls. For now, children of horror, legion of ghouls. We dedicate tonight's tale to the Creeper of the Crypt, ARW CWB, the ghastly ghoul Carl Meyer, the Ripper's right hand Thomas Swafford, and the haunter of the moors Archie Sinclair. Devilishly devoted to horror, may your souls always be. Tonight, we fan the flames with The Tibetan Box by Elizabeth Walter, first published in 1965 for her horrific Snowfall and Other Chilling Events. This gruesome tale inspired Clive Barker's Books of Blood. Enjoy. The Tibetan Box by Elizabeth Walter. It was during tea that the Tibetan box was first mentioned. As soon as she noticed it incongruously perched on the rosewood work table in the window, Alice Norrington wondered how she could possibly have overlooked it till then. In the same instant, she asked in her most authoritarian manner, "Mary, where did you get that box?" From her sofa, Mary Norrington followed the direction of her sister's gaze. She was not yet used to being a semi-invalid, and the excitement of her only sister's return after a 3-year tour of duty in the mission field had tired her more than she wanted to admit. As if that were not enough, there was the strain of a third person's presence. She had somehow never suspected that her sister would be accompanied by her friend and colleague, Ellen Whitaker. Equally, it had obviously never occurred to Alice that Miss Whitaker was not included in the invitation. An extra room had to be made ready as unobtrusively as possible. Mrs. Forrest, who had not been pleased. Moreover, since the moment of her arrival, Alice had kept up a ceaseless catechism on Mary's health, finances, future plans, and wishes. Now, she had started on the box. "I bought it in a jumble sale," Mary said tiredly. "It's rather unusual, isn't it? It's unusual to find anything worth buying in a jumble sale," Miss Whitaker observed. Alice was already on her feet. "May I look at it?" she asked, moving briskly across the room at a rate that Mary now envied, remembering that she could have equaled it a mere 6 months ago. A moment later, she was calling from the window, "I say, this is magnificent. Ellen, come here and have a look at this. Why don't you bring it nearer the fire?" Miss Whitaker asked placidly, continuing to sip her tea. The visit to Alice's sister was proving even more difficult than she had expected, and she had never expected very much. She had expressed her doubts about accompanying Alice, but Alice, in her autocratic way, had insisted that she should, and since Miss Whittaker had no friends or relatives in England, she had allowed her scruples to be overborne. Now, of course, she was regretting it. Her presence was too obviously neither anticipated nor desired. Moreover, as is often the way with sisters, Mary and Alice were too much alike to get on. The same imprudence, arrogance, and self-confidence, a strong personality, in short, were evident in both the Misses Norrington. They had never forgotten that they were the squire's daughters, and that it was for them to be liberal with advice, lofty in example, and inalienably right at all times. Alice at least possessed considerable administrative ability. The African mission field was pockmarked by her vigorous descents upon it, but neither sister possessed what Miss Whittaker would have described as humility. Mary, for all her weakened state, was the less humble of the two. She was sitting up now with something of her old decisive manner. It was all very well for Alice to invade her home, even though that home was no more than 4-bedroomed Throstle Cottage, when once they had been used to living at the Hall. Times and servants might not be what they had been. Incomes remained fixed in a world where all else rose, but an English woman's home was still her castle, and only one woman was in control. "Bring the box over here, Alice," she commanded, superimposing her orders on Miss Whittaker's request. "And please draw the curtains while you're at the window. It's already beginning to get dark." She was right. The garden was filling with shadows. The trees, still in leaf, for it was only October as yet, were bowing to one another in a gently rising wind. "This will bring the leaves down," Alice Norrington reflected. "We must sweep the garden and have a bonfire soon." As though she had communicated her thoughts in some way, Mary said, "We need another log on this fire, Alice dear. I wonder if you would be good enough to put one on." Her sister complied with some annoyance, placing the box on her chair. Mary's severe heart attack had in no way softened that organ. She was as autocratic as she had ever been, more so in fact, for her invalid state gave her certain rights and privileges which she was not slow to abuse. Nevertheless, it seemed odd and unnatural to see Mary so much shrunken and aged. Her face had a grayness despite a discreet use of makeup. The excitement of their arrival had made her pant. The doctor said bluntly it had been touch and go with her. It was doubtful if she would ever lead a normally active life again. And the attack had come without the slightest sign or warning. Since childhood, Mary had never had a day's illness in her life. If it came to that, Alice thought she hadn't either. The Norringtons were what one might call healthy stock. She smiled grimly and stood up, brushing her tweed skirt as she did so. Ellen Whitaker had picked up the box. It was on her lap, and from where she stood, Alice could see it clearly. It reaffirmed her impression that it was a magnificent piece of work, made of some unknown dark hardwood, its carvings burnished by age and care to a subtle sheen. It measured some 13 by 9 by 3¾ inches and was fitted with a hinged lid and a lock. The key was missing, but this could hardly count as a defect, and the lid and sides of the box were so ornately and intricately carved that it would have been well worth snapping up at a jumble sale, even if it had been in far worse condition. But whoever would give a box like that to a jumble sale? Major Murphy, Mary said when asked, adding, I don't think you would know him, Alice. They only came here since you were last home on leave. They took the Red House on a 7-year renewable tenancy. Y'all liked them so much. Stella Murphy was a great gardener. She had that garden looking lovely. Such a pity. The new people have let it go. New people? Didn't the Murphys finish their tenancy? My dear, the most dreadful thing. Stella died. Good gracious, Alice exclaimed. How tragic. Tragic it certainly was. She jabbed the fork into her finger while bedding out some rock plants. Such a little cut it was. I saw it. Within 48 hours, she was dead. Tetanus. I never heard anything so dreadful. Alice duly echoed her sister, but Ellen Whitaker, who had seen and heard many dreadful things, did not. Instead, she asked, examining the box intently, Did the Major tell you where this came from? I don't think he knew, Mary said. It actually belonged to Stella. I thought it rather unfeeling putting something of hers in the sale, but perhaps he only wanted to help the church. He was leaving the district, and it was such an obvious snip. I asked him what he estimated it was worth, and he said he thought £1 would be plenty. So I put in 30 shillings and took it home myself. I never thought to ask him where it came from, but it looks Chinese to me. Miss Whitaker shook her head decidedly. It's not Chinese. I can tell you that for sure. I'd say it was Tibetan. The sisters looked at her inquiringly. Ellen, how do you know? Alice asked. I was in India before I came to Africa, Miss Whitaker answered. I spent some time in Nepal. It's on the Tibetan border. I've seen a good deal of Tibetan work. If you can read their writing, Mary suggested, there's an inscription underneath that might help. I asked Major Murphy about it, and he said he didn't know what it meant. I'm sure he was lying somehow. It's probably something not quite nice. The carvings don't look particularly erotic, Alice observed with interest. Offhand, I'd have said they were threatening in some way. The adjective was a disturbingly apt one. The surface of the lid was filled by a rampant dragon, his face surrounded by a curious beard or frill. His eyes must originally have been jewels, but now only the empty sockets remained. From these flared two long whiskers like a mandarin's moustache. Face and body were covered with fish-like scales, and a ridge of spines ran down the center of the back. One forefoot was raised as if to lash out, and every foot had 4 wicked-looking claws. The body writhed and coiled in undulation this way and that across the lid. The tail, with a final upward flick towards the vertical, was finished with a vicious little barb. Round the sides of the box were lesser dragons, carved in profile but equally aroused. 2 dragons faced each other on the long side. On the short, a single dragon glared outwards at the world. There seems no reason why the Major shouldn't have translated the inscription, Alice continued. Do you think he knew what it said? He very well may have done. I understand he was in the Indian Army. And how long ago did all this take place? Alice questioned. It's 7 months today since I bought the box, Mary said, seeing her sister look startled. She elaborated. The jumbled sale was on a Saturday. Contributions were brought in on Thursday to leave us Friday for marking and pricing the stuff. So I bought the box on a Thursday, and 3 weeks later I had my heart attack. I remember when that was without trying, so that makes it 7 months to the day. It's a pity there wasn't a longer interval, she added. I was going to have the dragon's missing eyes restored. I thought rubies, perhaps very small and deep and glowing. She was interrupted by a cry from Ellen Whitaker, who was gazing intently at the underside of the box. What is it? Alice asked. A protruding nail? No, oh no. It's nothing like that. It's this inscription. Do you mean to say you can read it? I'm afraid I can. Mary clapped her hands in childlike triumph. I'm so glad. I've been longing to know what it says. You won't be so glad when you hear it. Is it really something obscene? I wish it were, Ellen Whitaker said grimly. She put the box on the floor and drew imperceptibly away.
"It's Tibetan, all right,"
she informed them.
"A Tibetan magician's box. In it would have been kept all the tools of his art or profession, closely guarded from curious eyes."
"A sort of conjurer's box?" Alice suggested.
"No, something more sinister than that. There is no accounting for the power of these magicians. No rational explanation will suffice. They can bless or curse with equal efficaciousness, and the inscription on the box is a curse. What a terrible hold superstition has on these people."
Alice Norrington was already planning a crusade. Miss Whitaker answered her sharply.
"Superstition's hardly the word. You don't have to believe in their magic to be affected."
"Even in England?" Mary inquired. Miss Whitaker did not trouble to answer. She had seen Tibetan magic at work, but the Mrs. Norrington, younger and less experienced, were clamorous to know details.
"Why the curse?"
Alice Norrington demanded.
"In case the box was stolen,"
her friend replied.
"The magician's is a hereditary calling. The box would be handed down from father to son. It could only fall into unauthorized hands because it was stolen. In the first instance, at any rate. Hence the curse on all those who possess it. They have no right to it, you see."
"I like that!" Mary Norrington exclaimed angrily.
"I paid a perfectly fair price for that box."
Her anger was the greater because it was not strictly ethical to buy items before the jumble sale had started. She remembered Major Murphy had looked at her oddly at the time.
"There was nothing dishonest about my acquiring it,"
she said defensively.
"How did Major Murphy get hold of it? Do you know?" "I told you it belonged to Stella."
"The woman who died of tetanus?"
"Ah, yes."
Miss Whitaker stood up abruptly, clasping her hands behind her, feet astride. She looked oddly out of place among the chintz and afternoon tea things of Throstle Cottage. Too gaunt, too sallow, too much an archetype. "Mary," she announced, putting all the urgency into her words of which she was capable. "You must get rid of that accursed box." "Certainly not. It's one of my favorite possessions. If you don't, you'll be dead in 6 months." "Whatever are you talking about, Ellen? What has the box to do with me?"
"Merely that it promises death within a 12-month to all unlawful possessors. You've already had half your time."
There was a moment's horrified silence. Then Mary Norrington gave a shaky laugh. "You're not going to tell me you believe this nonsense, Ellen? You, a worker in the Christian mission field?"
"Christianity has nothing to do with it,"
Miss Whitaker answered firmly.
"These magicians have a curious control over natural forces to which the human body is as much subject as anything else. I needn't point out the coincidence of your having a heart attack 3 weeks after you first acquired the box. I beg you to get rid of it before further mischief comes upon you, as most assuredly it will. Her sincerity was so obvious that Mary Norrington began to hesitate. The heart attack that had so sorely reduced her had come like a bolt from the blue. There was no history of cardiac disorder in the family, and she herself had seemed as strong as an ox. Her doctor had been quite unable to account for it, although he assured her there was nothing unique about her case. What was even more disturbing was her failure to make a good recovery. 6 months later, she was still as weak as a kitten, and this had been preying on her mind. Nonetheless, she had no intention of yielding to Ellen Whitaker's superstition. Such a show of respect for heathen practice should receive no condonation from her. I hardly see how I can give the box away, she said sweetly. Now that you have acquainted me with the nature of the curse, it would be tantamount, surely, to murder. I do not think I could bring myself to commit that. The best thing would be to return it to Tibet, Miss Whitaker suggested, and hope that it falls into good hands. There might be difficulties with the customs declaration. Besides, can one send things to Tibet? I have a friend in India who might help us. Why go to so much trouble?
Alice Norrington asked. She had been listening uneasily to the argument, which reflected her own divided state of mind. On the one hand, her faith and reason were against it. On the other was the fact that Mary was ill, and there was not only Mary, but also the previous owner, the late Mrs. Murphy. Of course, both could be coincidence merely. All the same, it was unpleasantly odd. But Alice's was a direct, uncomplicated nature. The devious was foreign to her mind. She was accustomed to going to the root of any problem, and her solutions were effective, if extreme.
Why bother to return the box to Tibet? She repeated. Why not simply destroy it here and now?
Mary smiled at her with sisterly approval.
An excellent notion, my dear.
With Alice, thought was quickly succeeded by action.
If you have no objection, I will attend to it straight away. There is no doubt a hatchet in the cellar. I will chop it up for firewood at once. I wouldn't if I were you, Alice.
Miss Whitaker had gone very pale. Both sisters regarded her in amazement.
Ellen, what is it? Are you ill?
No.
But you must not touch that box. It is dangerous. I really must ask you to explain. There is another line in the inscription,
Miss Whitaker whispered.
It promises destruction to anyone attempting to destroy. So one can neither keep the box nor destroy it. What can one do with it, may I ask?
Miss Whitaker shook her head helplessly.
You can only send it back. Nonsense, Ellen. Alice Norrington spoke very firmly. You must not allow these superstitious thoughts to get a hold. You will soon be little better than the heathen you are supposed to be converting. This error must be rooted out at once. I shall go to the cellar now and dispose of this ridiculous Tibetan magic box forever. No, as her friend put out a restraining hand. Don't try to stop me. I have quite made up my mind. You will regret it, Ellen Whitaker murmured. You will regret it all your life, or what is left. Alice Norrington did not bother to answer, and a moment later they heard her going down the cellar stairs. The cellar was directly under the sitting room, and they could hear her moving about, shifting the chopping block into position, and then a clatter as she dropped the axe. Mary Norrington jumped as though the blade had bitten into her, but Miss Whitaker showed all the calmness of despair. A moment later, they heard the first ringing blows of the hatchet, and perceptibly, they both relaxed. When one is ill, Mary said apologetically, one so easily becomes overwrought. When one has spent long years on the Tibetan border, Miss Whitaker responded bravely, one forgets that in England its standards do not apply. Before she had finished speaking, both women were paralyzed by a hoarse and terrible cry. It rose out of the depths of the cellarage beneath them, an animal cry of anguish and pain and fear. The voice was recognizably Alice Norrington's. A moment later, they heard her stumbling up the stairs. Both listeners were on their feet in an instant, but Miss Whitaker was first through the door. The cellar door opened into the hall of Throstle Cottage. Alice Norrington had almost reached the top of the cellar stairs. She had been silent since that first inexplicable scream of terror, but they could hear the rasping of her breath. Mary was leaning white-faced upon the hall table. It fell to Miss Whitaker to move towards the cellar door. She was halfway across the hall when Alice entered. Her features were still rigid from the shock she had undergone. Blood was spurting from a hand on which 3 fingers were now missing. Her protruding eyes were fixed unseeingly in space. Mary hid her face in her hands with a little cry of horror. But it was not the first time Ellen Whitaker had faced emergency. She had seen violent death and bodies torn and broken, and her common sense and energy, as usual, did not fail to respond. Almost before her senses had recovered, her brain was active, propelling her body forwards, uttering commands. It's all right, Alice. Don't be frightened. Mary, the doctor, quick! No, give me the table napkins before you telephone. We must put a tourniquet on at once. Keep your head down, Alice. It may help you to feel better. I promise you, we'll not let you die of this. Half carrying, half dragging, she got the fainting Alice to a chair. Mary was already dialing the doctor's number.
as she applied pressure to the artery in the wrist. To her relief, the blood spurts slackened and slowed to nothing, although the blood continued to well out copiously. Alice moaned and stirred and endeavored to sit upright.
"It's all right,"
Miss Whitaker reassured her.
"It's better you shouldn't look."
Alice took no notice of the injunction. Her eyes were still staring and wild. From the sitting room, Mary's voice on the telephone came faintly.
"My sister,
"An accident. Come at once." Suddenly, Alice gripped her friend's arm with unexpected intensity. Her fingertips were cold on Miss Whitaker's flesh.
it was the box.
She whispered hoarsely.
It moved as I was about to strike it and dragged my fingers under the axe. Otherwise, it would never have happened. But the box moved, and I couldn't stop it. I tell you, Alan, the Tibetan box moved.
While Alice Norrington was in hospital, Miss Whitaker remained at Throstle Cottage in a position which she rapidly recognized as that of unpaid companion drudge. There was no doubt that Mary Norrington had been shaken by her sister's accident. There was equally no doubt that with her heart condition, shock and distress were liable to bring on another attack, which attack might possibly prove fatal. But this was problematical. Miss Whitaker could not feel that it warranted the day in, day out attendance she was obviously expected to provide. By the end of the first week, she had enough not only of Mary's tyranny, but of Mary's patronage, which was worse. It began with Miss Whitaker's appearance. Mary had no scruples about making personal remarks. Indeed, it amused Miss Whitaker to note the resemblance between the sisters, except that, whereas Alice spent her energies in the mission field, Mary Norrington pursued lesser ends nearer home. But she adopted the same bludgeoning tactics as her sister, with possibly comparable results. For while there was no doubt that Alice was effective in securing conversions, Miss Whitaker wondered to what extent they represented change of heart. She was half amused, half horrified to find herself giving way to Mary, putting cold cream on her face for the first time in 20 years, and treating her dry hair to an oil bath before a special shampoo. She consoled herself that she was doing it for Alice, but she was too honest to accept such glazing for long. She was doing it for the sake of peace and quietness. Alice's converts presumably did the same. The thought of Alice as a colleague brought back to her the tragic aspect of the affair, for with her maimed hand it seemed unlikely that Alice would ever be past fit for service in the mission field again. Moreover, her nervous system had suffered a severe shock, and the tense, fevered woman who laid her sound hand like a claw on Miss Whitaker's arm whenever they were alone together and besought her to get rid of the Tibetan box was someone very different from the active, no-nonsense colleague whom Ellen Whitaker has always known. By common consent, they did not mention the matter to Mari, who knew nothing of her sister's allegation about the box. Mari tended, indeed, to dismiss the element of superstition in the accident.
Alice had always considered herself too practical. She claimed it was inevitable that she should someday have to recognize her limitations. Why, she could not even thinly slice a loaf of bread. To attempt to chop up hardwood was sheer folly.
Miss Whitaker thought she did not exaggerate, though of course it had not been Mari who had to venture into the cellar, blood bespattered like a slaughterhouse, and retrieve the box to which Alice Norrington's fingers were adhering, glued into place by sticky, congealing blood. If it had been, Miss Whitaker thought grimly, she could not have borne to restore the box to its accustomed place in the sitting room, where its incongruous presence was now emphasized by a gash from the axe along the edge of the lid. She wondered if Mari would be insensitive enough to leave the box there when her sister came out of hospital. She was rather afraid that she would. Her surprise and relief were therefore considerable when, returning from a visit to Alice one afternoon, she saw that the box had gone from the rosewood work table in the window. Before she could inquire the reason, Mrs. Forrest came in to say that Miss Mari was lying down in her room.
"Is she worse?"
Miss Whitaker demanded, fearing some fresh disaster.
The vicar called, and then she was too poorly. She said I was to ask you to go in.
The vicar's visits were not usually distressing. Miss Whitaker hastened to ascertain the facts, tapping at the door of the bedroom, the former dining room, since Mari was now unable to manage stairs. She found her sitting up in bed with the same tense and twitching anxiety that her injured sister habitually displayed.
"What's the matter?"
Miss Whitaker asked non-committally.
"I have had a very serious shock. It means that you are right about the box, Ellen. We must certainly dispose of it at once."
Miss Whitaker wondered what the vicar could have had to do with this development. She was not left long in doubt.
"We had been speaking of Alice's accident,"
Mari Norrington said faintly. "And I remembered what you said about the box, how it must have been stolen in the first place, because such objects were always handed down. It occurred to me to ask the vicar if he had any idea how Stella had acquired it, and to my surprise, he had. He said she inherited it from her father only 6 months before she died."
"An old family treasure?"
Miss Whitaker inquired softly, though the sinking of her heart already told her this was not going to prove to be the case.
"Not at all. The old man had bought it at an auction without even knowing what it was. He was something of an antique collector and had bid for a mahogany roll-top desk. When the desk was delivered, the box was discovered in a drawer. The auctioneer said he could reckon it as part of the lot. He had no interest in it and stored it away in an attic, where it was found only after his death. Because he too died, Ellen, within a year of acquiring it. He caught pneumonia, and it proved too much for his heart. So it begins to look as if you're right about the curse, doesn't it? Especially when I tell you this last bit. You'll remember I told you Stella's father bought the box accidentally at an auction. Well, do you know why that auction was taking place? I can guess, Miss Whitaker murmured sotto voce. Mary Norrington seemed not to hear. The owner of the house had been killed in a car crash, she whispered. His widow put everything up for sale. I don't know how long he'd had the box or who'd had it before him, but I am certain the box was to blame. So many deaths cannot be coincidence. I was foolish not to have believed you before. There is clearly something noxious about the object. I have had Mrs. Forrest put it in the garden shed. That won't save you, Mrs. Whitaker said automatically. Mary Norrington gripped her arm. Then what will? We cannot give it away because it will bring destruction upon others. And we know what happened when Alice tried to chop it up. Of course, she is, as I say, rather clumsy, but I should not wish anyone else to try. How, then, are we to rid ourselves of this evil object? Or must I, like its previous owners, die? We could burn it, Miss Whitaker said slowly. Magic is supposed to have no power against fire. Like burning a witch in the old days? Yes, Ellen Whitaker answered. A little like that. And would you be prepared to burn it? Do you think it would be safe for you to try? Miss Whitaker looked thoughtful. Yes, I think so. At any rate, I am prepared to make the attempt. Only not in the house, in the garden. I will do it tomorrow, if it is fine. Mary Norrington relaxed against her pillows. Dear Ellen, what should I do without you? You are such a tower of strength. And I believe your hair is looking better for that oil treatment. We must remember to try another one quite soon. Miss Whitaker was for once glad to take up the subject of her appearance in preference to the burning of the box. She was reluctant to admit to Mary Norrington that her knowledge of magic was greater than she had disclosed, for Ellen Whitaker was intellectually adventurous and by no means prepared to stop short at the limits of Christian belief when there was something outside it that seemed worth her exploration. In Nepal, she had made friends with a magician who, besides much else, had taught her a secret sign, which would, he claimed, protect her from all danger should anyone ever lay a spell on her. Miss Whitaker had been suitably grateful, having witnessed Tibetan magic at work, but she had shortly afterwards been posted to Africa and had never needed to make use of the sign. She was relieved about this for several different reasons, not the least being that she felt it incompatible with her faith. To inquire into native magic was one thing, to resort to its ritual something else. For this reason, she had never mentioned her knowledge. In fact, she had half forgotten it herself until the destruction of the Tibetan box became imperative and she realized that the task must fall to her, for she alone had the power to overcome its magic, provided she used the chosen agent, fire. The next day was fine and almost windless. Miss Whitaker resolved to have her bonfire after lunch. The morning was spent in preparation, for she was anxious that nothing should go wrong. She had amassed a pile of leaves and withered branches, chrysanthemum stalks, and rotting flower heads, and to these she added firewood from the cellar, old newspapers, and a paraffin-impregnated briquette. The pyre was built at the very bottom of the garden, on waste ground sheltered by the angle of the wall, which at this point was bare of fruit trees, so that no living thing should suffer any harm. Nevertheless, Miss Whitaker knew a certain uneasiness which common sense was unable to dispel. Perhaps it was this that made her place 2 buckets of water within easy reach of her prospective blaze. She was taking no chances with magic, and that included her own untried magic power. She was relieved when Mary Norrington announced that she would not be present at the incineration. She would not even watch from the sitting room. This meant that there would be no one to witness the operation, for the nearest house was some little distance away. Mrs. Forrest went home at 2:30. Whatever happened, there would be no one there to see. If it became necessary to resort to the use of magic, Miss Whitaker could do so in secret and alone. All the same, she sincerely hoped it would not be necessary, and took all scientific precautions first. In addition to the 2 buckets of water, she equipped herself with tongs and a rake. Stout Oxfords and thick socks protected feet and ankles, and her hands were shielded by heavy, gauntlet gloves. Her tweed skirt would have smothered fire sooner than kindled. The same went for her cardigan of Shetland wool. Her head was muffled in a scarf tied turban fashion. Not a single lock poked forth from underneath. Miss Whitaker was particularly careful with the turban, which was doing double duty that afternoon. Not only did it serve to protect her hair from harsh fragments, but it also concealed its unappetizingly greasy state. Miss Whitaker, having submitted that morning to another of Mary Norrington's oil treatments, to be followed that evening by another special shampoo. But between the morning and the evening came the afternoon, and Mary had retired for her rest, clutching the box to her like a living creature. Miss Whitaker made a conspiratorial exit from the garden shed. The sun was shining with almost the warmth of summer. She felt herself sweating under her wool-on tweed. The thought of fire heat as well was intolerable. She had a sudden impulse to go back. The sharp contours of the box recalled her to a sense of duty. To leave it intact would mean that Mary Norrington must die, or, if not Mary, some other innocent possessor. There was nothing for it. The box must be destroyed, and the burning of wood was an entirely natural process. There was no reason why she should feel this growing fear. Besides, if the worst happened, and there were unnatural manifestations, she had only to make the sign. The magician had assured her it was infallible. Whatsoever saw it must withdraw at once. She was probably the one person in England who could burn the box in safety. With trembling hands, she knelt and lighted the pyre. The paraffin briquette caught at once, and so did the paper. Then the sticks kindled into a lively blaze. The twigs caught, and some of the drier dead leaves crackled. The smell of autumn burning filled the air. The bonfire was built high in the center to support a level platform of sticks. Miss Whitaker approached and placed the Tibetan box upon it, then stepped backwards with a nervous little gasp. The fire continued to burn brightly, with much crackling and showering of sparks. Then, as it spread to the damp leaves, stalks, and flower heads, it began to give off smoke. Miss Whitaker drew back, coughing. She had not supposed there would be so pungent a smell. The fire, too, was burning less brightly. The afternoon seemed suddenly overcast. Looking up, she was astonished to see the smoke reeling in dense black clouds overhead, forming a tinted ceiling above her, shutting out the sky and the sun. Meanwhile, its columns continued to reeve upwards with a curious serpentine twine, so black they appeared to have substance and to move in response to some directional control. The box had remained untouched in the center of the bonfire, which was subsiding now into ash. So far as Miss Whitaker could see, the flames had not even touched it. She poked nervously with the rake, causing the platform of sticks to collapse with a sputter, tilting the box on its side. The smoke was growing momentarily more acrid. It was becoming difficult to breathe. Miss Whitaker's eyes were watering. She clapped a handkerchief to her nose. No doubt it was blurred vision that first made her perceive in the smoke coils a vaguely remembered design, that double curve folding back on itself with a foot uplifted. Was it not the dragon of the box? She wiped her eyes, blaming an overstrained nervous system, and looked again. But surely those were scales, black and sinuous and almost stationary. The dragon reared up from the pyre. The terrible four-clawed feet were extended, groping. The head, in profile now, moved lightly from side to side. Miss Whitaker could see clearly the protective frills surrounding jaw and throat. The mandarin whiskers, even longer and thinner than she remembered them, trailed off into wisp of smoke. Now,
and again a puff exuded from the wide-spaced, flaring nostrils. Each time the cavernous mouth opened, there was a rolling belch of smoke. The dragon seemed to be searching for something. Its body made sudden lurches in the air. It was, for all the world, as if it were playing blind man's buff with an imaginary opponent, who, fortunately for him, was never there. For there was no doubt of the dragon's hostile intentions. The groping claws were poised to seize and tear, and the size of the creature was such that a full-grown buffalo could have been dismembered as easily as a rat. Miss Whitaker watched in horrified fascination. She had never seen anything to equal this. This was Tibetan magic with a vengeance, which was what the dragon appeared to desire, and she herself was its immediate object. Instinctively, she drew a little further back. It was one thing to know the sign which would invalidate Tibetan magic, but quite another to have to put it into use. She flexed her fingers into the required position. At least she had not forgotten what to do. It was comforting to realize that she had power over this dragon who looked so terrible and black. A twig snapped sharply behind her. As if it had heard, the dragon turned its head. The long neck undulated gently. At the other end of the beast, the barbed tail lashed. The smoke which composed the dragon had now completely blotted out the sky. The brightness of the flames had sunk to the dull glow of ashes. A wind seemed suddenly to have sprung up. It lifted the frill about the dragon's jawline. The mandarin whiskers streamed wide. The distended nostrils were aquiver as the dragon sought to scent its prey. Suddenly, the head poised in its veering peregrinations. Despite the smoke it had caught Miss Whitaker's scent, with a tremendous writhe of all its coils and convolutions, it reared up to its full height. The claws were fully extended, some 4 feet above her. The bearded face looked down. It held an indescribable weight of menace. For all her confidence, Miss Whitaker began to be afraid. She raised her hand in the required ritual gesture and looked up to meet the dragon's gaze. It peered down at her, evil and impassive, from the orbless sockets of its eyes. With a little scream, Miss Whitaker flung herself sideways as the dragon's claws lashed down. They missed her, but she felt the wind of their passing. The dragon reared itself again. Now that it seemed to have her scent in its nostrils, it proved impossible for her to evade. Whichever way she darted in the smoke pile, the blind monster's claws were just behind. There was a clatter as she knocked over the buckets. The water spread round her, soaking her socks and shoes. She was already exhausted and panting. The acrid fumes from the pyre were making her choke and cough. The house, the garden, seemed suddenly to have receded. There was only darkness and smoke. On the fire which gave the dragon its being, the Tibetan box lay upended, still untouched. If only the flames would consume it the dragon would surely cease to exist. Seizing the rake, Miss Whitaker made one last desperate assault upon it and thrust it into the heart of the fire, while the dragon reared itself above her, preparing to nail her to the ground. At the last moment, by a dexterous twist and feint, she escaped it. A shower of sparks rained down. They smoldered for a moment on her heavy woolen garments. Gasping, Miss Whitaker beat them out. One corner of the box had taken. The wood was beginning to char. The dragon, though still dangerous, appeared to be shrinking. The clouds of smoke were less voluminous, less dense, yet the heat seemed all at once to have become quite insupportable. Miss Whitaker had a sudden glimpse of the sun. She saw the house, the garden, the chrysanthemums, and the apple trees, the peaceful normality of it all. Then, as an unquenched spark ignited her oil-soaked hair into combustion, she ran screaming towards the house. She did not see her bonfire fall apart and burn itself out in isolated patches. She did not see the Tibetan box roll free. She saw only the horrified face of Mary Norrington as she emerged from her room into the hall.
Mary, help me! Help me!
Miss Whitaker screamed in terror, endeavoring to beat out the flames. But Mary only stood, white-faced, and clutching the doorpost, unable to either move or speak. She saw before her Ellen Whitaker's body, on her head a strange corona of flame, the skin of the scalp already blackening and peeling, the face distorted beyond belief. This apparition from hell was advancing towards her. The Tibetan box's curse was coming true. With a cry, Mary Norrington doubled up in the doorway. She was dead before her body reached the ground. The double tragedy at Throstle Cottage, as the newspapers called it, did nothing to reassure Miss Alice Norrington as to the innocuous nature of the box. Nor did her convictions regarding this fire and axe-scarred object, and her insistence on returning it via the late Miss Whitaker's friend in India to Tibet, do anything to reassure her superiors at evangelical headquarters as to her suitability for return to the mission field. She was compulsorily retired from service without too much protesting on her part, and now lives on the south coast near Worthing and attends psychometry readings once a week. Thank you for listening. Have a great night.